There you go.
All right, thank you, Maddie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all who have registered to attend our Middle East Peace Now June Forum. We would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, and this list is growing and we love it. Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities, Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Minnesota, Anti-War Committee, Northfielders for Justice in Palestine and Israel, Eastside Freedom Library, and Women Against Military Madness. We greatly appreciate all of these organizations posting and promoting our Middle East Peace Now monthly forums. Thank you. I'll now turn the webinar over briefly to fellow board member Madeleine Hallberg, who will go over the necessary housekeeping items for this forum. Maddie?
Thanks, Janet. Just a couple of administrative notes here. All participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll put them in the queue. You can use the chat feature for any administrative or help questions, and we'll do our best to assist you. Please be respectful in the chat and in the Q&A, and we do reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. If Zoom is not working for you, please email mepn@mepn.org and we will try to help. And the recording of this event will be available on the East Side Freedom Library's YouTube and MEPN's YouTube in the coming week. And so with that, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Maddie. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Malkah Bird is a community organizer, teacher, and co-founder of Rising Collective in Indianapolis, Indiana. Her Jewish Voice for Peace activities include organizing, speaking, and providing training on issues relating to equity and community building. Malkah's own activism is inspired by historic Jewish traditions and values for peace, justice, equality, and activism. Malkah will speak today about the distinctions between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the importance of solidarity in the movement for justice for Palestinians. Welcome, Malkah.
Thank you so much. I'm just beyond thrilled to be here. So I really appreciate you all having me. I looked over the speakers that you've had over the past couple of years, and wow, it's quite an amazing group of individuals. So what an honor to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going. So yeah, I thank you for that introduction, Janet and Maddie. And I'm an organizer in Indianapolis, Indiana, with Jewish Voice for Peace. And I'm also a teacher, a longtime kindergarten, preschool teacher, and currently I'm working as a psychologist here in Indiana. So I have a couple different hats that I wear, but I've been involved locally with Jewish Voice for Peace since like about 2014, 2015, and then also involved at the national level doing some different work. So I'm going to talk from that perspective a little bit today. I think, you know, if you've been involved in this work in any capacity, particularly Palestinians and people of color who are advocating for Palestine, but also pretty much anybody else, I think this experience of talking about anti-Semitism is probably something that's come up for you, accusations of anti-Semitism, sort of trying to figure out how to navigate all this. So it's a really important conversation to have in some regards. And I also have some hesitations, which I'll share in a minute too. But I think if you're in the question and answer and in the chat and however you all do things, like it's really, I would love to hear your experiences too, because I think there's obviously a lot of knowledge and experience around what it means to talk about anti-Semitism in the context of organizing for Palestine and Palestinian justice. So I'm always curious to hear people's experiences with this too. So please feel free to speak up. All right, let's just get going and then we'll have lots of questions and time to talk later. So this morning, we're going to talk about a little bit on the history of modern anti-Semitism. And I think some of the important parts of that, and we'll talk, is that it it's difficult, I've been told that this group is very knowledgeable about the history in Palestine and Zionism, and so we won't have to cover that, but I think we'll see as we look at sort of European anti-Semitism that it's a parallel story. It's difficult to tell one story without the other story. So there is value in kind of understanding some of this history as we conceptualize Palestine and Zionism and how it came to be. We're going to talk about the difference between anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, which is obviously a critical distinction that we need to be making all the time. We're going to talk about the very specific Jewish complaint against Zionism, which is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about, and I'm going to just share my perspective on that. This has obviously come up in your region. It's popping up all over the country right now, this idea of defining anti-Semitism and how we define anti-Semitism and if we should, and what that means and who is harmed by that and who benefits from that process. So we'll look at a little bit at some of these definitions that are being talked about and dig a little deeper into that. And then specifically, we have some stories to share from Indianapolis on how this is going at Butler University around IRA and these definitions. And I'm lastly just curious how this has impacted your work for collective liberation, like these ideas of defining anti-Semitism, this sort of presence of this concept as we move forward with Palestine. So those are the topics we're going to cover. And then, of course, anything else that comes up will be great to hear about too. Okay. All right. So this is a timeline of modern anti-Semitism that will, obviously there's 5 things on here. So this is, of course, not all inclusive, but I just want to cover some of the bigger points that may impact what we're thinking about. So basically in Europe in the late 1800s, and particularly in Russia, there were, sort of these smaller Jewish villages. And we saw a process known as pogroms. And these looked a lot of different ways, but a lot of times what they were violence, Russian violence in both like state violence, but also just community violence against these Jewish communities. And so they would come in, they would, destroy these towns, burn them, people would be killed, people would be displaced. And it was particularly targeting these Jewish villages. And this violence began in the 1800s and started to spread sort of across Russia, but particularly through Eastern Europe. This was happening. And it was part of this just sort of growing otherism of Jews in Europe at the time. And the term anti-Semitism was a term that started to be used around that time. It wasn't a term that Jews initiated. It was actually a term that was initiated by non-Jews to talk about being opposed to Jewish people. So they were anti-Semitic by this definition. And I've heard sometimes like criticism of this term of anti-Semitism as if it were another way that Jews were sort of claiming indigeneity, which we will talk about, but this was not a term created by Jewish people. This rise of nationalism in Europe is happening at the same time, and then we're seeing this increase in anti-Semitism spread across Europe. And at the time, this was, sort of early 1900s, we see a huge wave of migration of Jews leaving Eastern Europe and across Europe, but particularly Eastern Europe. Most of them went to the US, came here to the US. My family, a big chunk of my family emigrated at that point. Canada, other parts of the world, but we did start to see at that time some Jews also moving to Palestine. So there started to be this migration to Palestine around that same time, and different ideas about if that was the right or wrong thing to do from these Jewish communities who were facing increased anti-Semitism across Europe. 1933, Hitler's elected as the Chancellor of Germany. So at this point, this populist movement in Germany post-World War I were really fomenting some pretty solid nationalistic ideas in Germany. And a lot of it is around this anti-Semitism, othering of Jews, hatred of Jews, and it's building. You know, obviously we know that these things just aren't one moment in history, that this is something that's building, that's happening there. So in 1938, which is sort of thought of as this turning point, we have an event called Kristallnacht that you may have learned about in the past. And it was the night of broken glass, and it happened across Germany, several different towns, mainly, you know, Berlin, but other parts of Germany as well. And the shops of Jewish owners the shop windows were broken, the shops were lit on fire, and I think many think of this as kind of the moment that we knew sort of this turning point for the Holocaust. The Holocaust sort of officially, we think of it as 1941 to 1945. And at the time, you know, historians say it was 6 million Jews, 5 million other, you know, Roma, communist, unionist, LGBTQ, disabled folks were killed by the Nazi Party. And that was, you know, across Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, issues throughout Russia. So it was really impacting that whole region. And following the Holocaust is when we saw another, you know, sort of massive migration of refugees, Jewish refugees leaving Europe, again, many coming to the US and others going to Palestine. You know, this refugee movement. So, you know, we think of Jewish immigration to the US as something that sort of happened all the way across the 1900s. And there were times where it was larger numbers happening. And then there were times when the US wasn't allowing Jewish refugees in. So, you know, the SS St. Louis is a famous story about that, of a boat of Jews leaving Germany to come to the US. And they, you know, stopped in ports, you know, all along here, and were turned away by both the US and Canada and sent back to Germany. That was in 1939. And many of them, the Jewish families that were on that boat ended up in Auschwitz, which is, you know, a large concentration camp in the Holocaust. So there was this feeling that the world was not supporting Jews, not opening their borders, opening their doors to Jewish refugees that were fleeing this mass violence across Europe leading up to World War II. So today, you know, we know that anti-Semitism is present, especially in Europe. There is a growing right-wing fascism in Europe and here in the US. We see slurs, stereotypes, there's interpersonal anti-Semitism that occurs. You see the swastika as imagery that's still used, cemetery desecrations, attacks on synagogues. You know, the most recent deadly one was in Pittsburgh. I think that, you know, we can all remember that one. There's the rise in Christian Zionism, to me, is very linked with anti-Semitism. You know, Christian Zionism is this idea that Jews need to return to Israel, to Palestine, so that, you know, about the second coming of Christ, of the Messiah, will come at that point. And the idea is that those who have not, you know, accepted that Savior will then not make it. And so there is anti-Semitism built into all of that, in my experience. This is a just image from Kristallnacht, and maybe these are images that you've seen before, but this was taken from Berlin, and you know, there were these Jewish neighborhoods, sort of Jewish only neighborhoods, and kind of increasingly shrinking in size, of where the Jews were allowed to own businesses, and then eventually were no longer allowed to own businesses. This was the Charlottesville March in 2017 here, and lots of, you know, Nazi imagery, and they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." So anti-Semitism has always been a part of kind of right-wing fascism, neo-Nazism, and I think it's still very present in that movement at this point. So we're gonna talk about this, and I know this seems maybe a little simplistic, but I just want to clarify this as we move forward, and the terms that we use really do matter. And I personally have seen a lot of mixing up of these terminologies, and I think there's several reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons, I think, actually comes from within the Jewish community, is that these terms, a lot of times by Jewish organizations, are used somewhat interchangeably, and therefore then, and the symbols and the different things. And so anyone who's outside of that community wouldn't be blamed for seeing some overlap between these terms. But just so that we're clear, Judaism, that's a religious belief or a cultural identity. You have, Judaism as a religion. You have secular Jews. You have Jews who identify as ethnically as Jewish, but not necessarily religiously. But that itself is talking about a religious belief or a cultural identity. Israeli, separate from that, is a nationality. Like Israel is a state. If you're an Israeli, that's your nationality. And that is different than being Jewish or Judaism. And then Zionist is a political ideology, and we'll talk a little bit more about what Zionist means specifically, but Jewish, Israeli, and Zionist are not the same thing. They're not one and the same, contrary to what I think people believe or how people use those terminologies. And like I said, for good reason. Most synagogues around the country, not all, but many, have Israeli flags hanging in the synagogue here in the US. The synagogue, the closest one to my house that we don't belong to, for good reason, is that when you are in the school part of that, there's two clocks on the wall. There's a clock that shows the time in Indianapolis and a clock that shows the time in Israel. So I think within the Jewish community, there's been a blurring of these identities sometimes. And then outside of that, it happens again. And those of us like me who identify as Jewish anti-Zionists, a big part of what we know is important is to start to make distinctions between these different aspects of people's identity. So what we're talking about today, anti-Semitism, that is just straight up, that's a hostility to or prejudice against Jews because they're Jews. And this definition gets a lot more complicated, which we'll talk about later on this morning, but that is what anti-Semitism is. Then Zionism, like you said, is a political ideology that's a settler colonial movement for the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish state in Palestine, right? So Zionism was started in the late 1800s. Theodor Herzl is considered to be the father of modern Zionism. And he lived in Vienna. He was a Jew in Vienna, not particularly religious, and was defining this as a settler colonial movement. For a long time, Jews spoke openly, Zionists spoke openly about this being a settler colonial movement. And for that reason, many Jews were opposed to it, and many Zionists and parts of the Jewish community were for the idea of the settler colonial movement. Now, I think Zionists today, many, have moved away from that terminology around colonialism for a variety of reasons, but there is no denying that that's what this was and how it started and what is still happening in Palestine. Anti-Zionism, therefore, is an anti-colonial movement that advocates for full equality for all Israelis and Palestinians. So it's about democracy, it's about decolonization. And then you hear this term, and this actually started in Europe, but it's spread here to the US, obviously. It's this idea of the new anti-Semitism. And this is really a redefining of anti-Semitism to include this idea of criticism of Israel, of Palestinian organizing, especially of BDS, that it falls under this category of a new kind of anti-Semitism. And this sort of exceptionalism that criticism of the state of Israel, because it is a Jewish state, therefore is automatically anti-Semitic, which we'll push back against a little bit today. So as I mentioned, and we can't overlap these terms. And part of the reason is that there's a long history of Jewish anti-Zionism. As long as there's ever been Zionism, there has been anti-Zionism, right? And Judaism is a very old religion. Judaism, was a religion a long time and an ethnicity before Zionism. It will continue after Palestine is free. Judaism will still be here. And as long as there have been Zionists, there have been Jewish anti-Zionists. So these are just a few different groups. This is a great article by Ben Lorber, who is a writer, researcher, Jewish anti-Zionist. And he talks about some of this history of Jewish anti-Zionism. So there is an Orthodox anti-Zionism that's deeply religious. And basically it says that interprets the Torah to say that Jews live in existential exile, that's part of the religion of Judaism is this idea of exile. And therefore the idea of returning to Palestine or returning to anywhere that was sort of biblically related is anathema to what we view Judaism is, that part of Judaism is being in this existential exile. There was for a very long time, up through the 60s, a strong movement of the reform branch of Judaism, of reform anti-Zionism. And this is the idea is that there's a lot of strength in the diaspora, that many of us identify as diasporan Jews, and that there's real value in finding safety and community and power and beauty in our diasporan experience here in the US, Canada, South America, just throughout the world. There have, a long time Palestinian Jews, Jews who are indigenous to the region, before 1948, the numbers are about anywhere from sort of 3 to 5% of the people living in Palestine were Jewish, and living peacefully among non-Jews, Muslims and Christians, Palestinians, Arabs in that region. And so Zionism ultimately was not beneficial for those communities. The Bund is a community that came up in Europe. It was a socialist, anarchist, sort of Ashkenazi, which is European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, that were came up in a reaction to anti-Semitism, fascism in Europe. They're a group of people that spoke Yiddish, and you sort of see I think we're seeing right now kind of a rebirth of this. You have diasporan Jews who have Ashkenazi roots who are learning Yiddish, relearning Yiddish, klezmer music, kind of connecting back to this Ashkenazi roots, this Ashkenazi history that in some ways has been erased through Zionist ethnic cleansing. We can think a little bit more about that. There's also a strong community of Mizrahi Jews. So that's a term that's used to mean Jews who are from the Arab world or from other parts, not Europe. So a strong community of North African Jews. There are Yemeni Jews. There are Ethiopian Jews who have a resistance to Zionism, in part because Zionism resulted in many Jews Mizrahi Jews being forced to leave their homes, come to Israel and to Palestine, and live in a lot of ways as second-class citizens. White supremacy abounds in Israel, and Ashkenazi Jews, white European Jews, are certainly the predominant sort of prioritized group in Israel, and Mizrahi Jews have experienced significant oppression in Israel because of white supremacy. There's a growing Israeli anti-Zionist movement. Some organizations, Zochrot, B'Tselem, are some of the organizations that are coming up as part of this movement. They're organizations that teach about the Nakba, that expose Israeli war crimes from a Jewish Israeli lens. And I think, we've seen imagery, we've seen sort of increasing pressure from those organizations and visibility. This is maybe some of the young people in Israel who are refusing military service and they're part of this kind of growing Israeli anti-Zionist movement. And then obviously, of course, there's a rapidly growing, and I would say we were one of the quickest growing groups of folks here of Jewish folks in the US, but anti-Zionist movement. JVP is a part of that, Jewish Voice for Peace. IJV, which is Independent Jewish Voices out of Canada. IJAN is the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. So this is a growing, if not now, I think is somewhat in there, just this growing movement of diasporic anti-Zionist Jews who are saying, like, not in our name, this is not what Judaism is for us. Like I said, I do think there's a very specific Jewish complaint against Zionism. Obviously, violence and colonization against Palestinians being done in our name is the first and foremost profound piece of this. But there is also other aspects to it. I think we have a very specific complaint that there's Zionist collaboration with anti-Semites. We see people like Trump, Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, other people who are openly anti-Semitic, who are celebrated because they are Zionists, and they're brought over to Israel and they're lifted up in our community when we are hearing these very obvious dog whistles, tropes, anti-Semitic behaviors, comments coming from them, and then see them uplifted by Israel and by other Zionists. There's because Israel is nationalistic and white supremacy and, borders and, all of this stuff, this very conservative values, when we center Israel at the center of Judaism here in the US, it moves our whole community towards these more conservative beliefs. And that particularly impacts our queer, Black, Indigenous, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Jews of color, because it means we are advocating for things like police in our synagogues and immigration policy that's not beneficial to these communities, and just generally more conservative viewpoints, voting for politicians that are more conservative because they support Israel, because they are Zionists, that end up hurting these members of our communities. When we put Israel at the center of our Jewish communities now, it's really unwelcoming to dissenting ideas, right? So it makes it hard for Jews like me to find spaces in many of our mainstream communities. Walk into the synagogue and you see an Israeli flag, then that's obviously not a place that's welcoming to my family. And I think because of Zionism and how it's been framed, there just isn't a lot of space for conversation. Now, I do think that's changing, and I'm happy to see that change, but in many communities, they're still not hosting sort of conversations around these topics that make a lot of space for any sort of dissenting anti-Zionist views. Another part is this erasure of the diasporic history, and this is what I referred to as the ethnic cleansing. So, as Zionism ethnically cleanses Palestine and sort of creates this false indigeneity for Ashkenazi Jews in Palestine, at the same time that they're trying to erase this Palestinian and steal this Palestinian history, it replaces our Jewish diaspora history. It replaces my European history and falsely creates this Middle Eastern history, or this Palestinian history for my family. My family is not from Palestine. We have no roots in that region. We are Russian Jews. And so I have not had the opportunity to learn about my Russian roots. I joke, like, we're borscht eating, like challah, just Ashkenazi Jews, we're Yiddish speaking Jews. And instead it's been replaced by this idea of, that my family somehow has this connection to Israel instead of this Russian connection, this European connection. And the other problem with how we're defining anti-Semitism as an anti-Zionism, if we do that, is that it isolates anti-Semitism from other forms of oppression, right? And we know that anti-Semitism shares roots in white supremacy, and it is fighting anti-Semitism is hand in hand with fighting against other forms of oppression, like Islamophobia, like anti-Blackness. So if we separate this out and say, no, this is about a nationalist movement, this is about Israel, really pulls anti-Semitism away from these other forms of oppression and doesn't help address the root causes of anti-Semitism. It's sort of like, look over here, look at Zionism, look at Israel, that's what we're talking about. And at the same time, ignoring the real threat of anti-Semitism, I think, that is violent and dangerous and does impact Jews in this country and around the world. So an example of this is that the shooting that happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was a white supremacist, and he chose that synagogue because there was a group in that synagogue that was working with a refugee organization that he had heard. This refugee organization was allowing Muslims to come up from South America in these caravans that Muslims were sneaking in. So his views were anti-immigrant, they were anti-Jewish, they were anti-Muslim. That was his viewpoint, which is why he went after the synagogue. So they're deeply linked, and in order to take on all of these together, we really have to talk about what we're talking about. So we're going to move forward to these definitions of anti-Semitism and dig in a little bit deeper. IHRA is the big one that we're seeing. The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. And I heard that this has been an issue locally for you all. I think that maybe this passed at the University of Minnesota. It's now coming into state legislatures. The State Department under Trump formalized IHRA. So it's coming, and amongst JVP, we've just been spending a lot of time thinking about kind of how to approach this as it comes into our state legislatures. This was written in, I think around 2002, this came up, and it was written by a group that was looking mostly at anti-Semitism in Europe and thinking about how to define it. And they wrote this working definition, and then it kind of went quiet for a little while. And now it has been sort of uplifted by Zionists as kind of a tool for ultimately suppressing free speech, particularly BDS, anti-BDS. So the first part of the definition is this 39-word definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, like, personally, I don't think it's a great definition aside from everything else that we're going to talk about with it. It's just, there's a lot that it doesn't do. And I don't know. I don't totally understand what this means, this first part. But this first part, these 39 words, are not the insidious piece of this definition. The insidious piece comes from the examples. So what they did was they wrote this definition and then they came up with examples. And it is really in these examples where we see this suppression of free speech happening, these real issues that are coming up around this. So sorry. Okay, so look at the ones in red in particular, obviously. This is where we start to get into Israel-specific language and defining criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And I have just heard some like really complicated doublespeak around this, sort of saying like, not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but some of it is, and nobody can tell which is which, if it's like an anti-Semite saying it or just someone who's legitimately criticizing Israel. Therefore, we have to suppress all criticism of Israel in order to combat any possible anti-Semitism. So it's like really kind of just double talk around how to think about anti-Semitism and think about how Zionism fits into that. And you can really see that if these definitions are adopted, if these examples are adopted, it puts Palestinians and those advocating for Palestine liberation in a really tough position, because it is a pretty pretty insidious way to define this that does silence free speech. And the concerns that we have, like in places like Indiana, first of all, on college campuses, we can see this being used easily as a tool to block organizations, to block any organization that supports BDS from forming. So that would include JVP, it would include SJPs, other groups that advocate for Palestine, even non-Palestinian organizations that just support BDS as part of their kind of general mission for justice can be impacted by the existence of this definition. It can prevent organizations, campus organizations, from signing on to BDS for fear that that would impact their ability to carry on as an organization. So it really does serve this purpose of quelling free speech and advocacy on campus. It also, in state legislators, I think the bigger concern, like one of the concerns we have here in Indiana, is that they just passed a very poorly written and vague hate crimes bill. And so we do have concerns that if something like IRA were to pass, it would be usable with something like a hate crimes bill, where all of a sudden somebody who writes Free Palestine in spray paint, you know, graffiti, now, because of this definition of anti-Semitism, instead of just being graffiti, now this is considered a hate crime and can be, those kinds of laws can be applied as such. So these are the things that we're keeping our eye on for IRA locally, certainly, and in other state legislators. So this came up, this is Kenneth Stern, and he said, it was never intended to be a campus hate speech code. IRA is being used as an attack on academic freedom and free speech and will harm not only pro-Palestinian advocates, but also Jewish students and faculty. And Kenneth Stern, this was sort of important that he said this because he's the author of IRA. And he is, speaking on IRA sort of all around the country, talking about how it's being misused at this point, and it's not helpful. So we'll talk a little bit more about IRA and kind of the talking points to combat that and specific examples of how it's a problem in just a minute. But I want to share a couple other definitions. So this is the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. This just came out, and it was written and supported by Jewish scholars like across the country. And it really came out as a response to IRA. And it basically just defines anti-Semitism as discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. And then it goes on with its own kind of examples. So these general ones are sort of more what we think of, talking about the Jewish tropes and denying the Holocaust, things that we, that do get said, like Jews control the media, Jews control the banks, and these things are anti-Semitic. Even when there are pieces of this that involve Zionism or pro-Israel, we have to be mindful of how these tropes can get used and spread, and the language that we use when we talk about influence and those kinds of things. So then Jerusalem Definition goes on, and it sort of specifies how people may talk about Israel and Palestine as in ways that could be anti-Semitic, right? And it gives these examples of specific ways that it could be. I think rightfully, there are a lot of issues that people take with this definition. This idea, holding all Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct or treating Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel, like, yes, we certainly don't want to do that. That doesn't make sense. As we know, as we just talked about, like all Jews are not Zionists, all Zionists are not Jews. It's a very important distinction. But sometimes I've seen this quite a bit over the past month as people are sort of speaking out more frequently against Israel, and people saying, like, why are you blaming American Jews for this? And I do think while we want to be careful about the language that we're using, we have to recognize that organized Jewish institutions like our JCRCs, like our Jewish federations, are pushing this message that Judaism and Zionism are one and the same, that there is this link. So in some ways, of course, it's coming from within the Jewish community, this idea that Judaism and Zionism are linked. So it is a bit disingenuous for them to, have Israeli flags everywhere, to tell people like me that we aren't, we don't belong in these Jewish communities and that we don't have a space in them because of our views on Israel, and then flip it around when something happens and say, like, don't blame all Jews for the actions of this and all that. So like, yes, and we want to be careful about both things, but I think we do need to recognize that, yes, this is absolutely coming also from within the Jewish community. So these are sort of what the definition says about, Israel and Palestine examples that may be anti-Semitic. But then it goes on and it has a section and it says, these are not anti-Semitic, right? And it specifically talks about criticizing or opposing Zionism, supporting Palestinians for full freedom, for human rights, civil rights, international law, pushing for international law. It talks about BDS and how BDS in and of itself is in no way anti-Semitic. It talks about criticizing Israel's human rights violations, that is not anti-Semitic to do that. Talk about how the US blocks UN resolutions. These are not anti-Semitic to make that complaint. Specifically, it mentions the phrase between the river and the sea, which, as we know, is this sort of touch point phrase. Mark Lamont Hill got fired for that phrase. So it is one of those places where I think Zionists do sort of yell anti-Semitism quite frequently when they hear that phrase. So it takes on all of that. And I have a sense that we are going to hear a lot more about the Jerusalem Declaration. I think that there is some money and some support being poured into this as kind of the tactic. Some people have decided that this is the tactic to suppress IRA, to fight back and push back against IRA definition, and are making a fairly strong argument for that. I think I have also heard on the flip side an equally strong argument that we know that organizing for Palestine, that advocating for justice in Palestine is not anti-Semitic. So any definition of anti-Semitism that includes anything about Israel or Palestine is unhelpful, right? It doesn't help the conversation. It buys into this narrative that anything to have to do with Palestine has to do with anti-Semitism, when we certainly know that it doesn't. So I've heard a lot of criticism and pushback against the Jerusalem Declaration for that reason, that there's no reason to define anti-Semitism in any way, shape, or form that connects it to Israel or Palestine, because we know that that's not what this is about and it's not what's happening. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that when we get to the Q&A part. And then here's one more definition that I think is being sort of widely shared. This comes from Independent Jewish Voices, and they have a working definition of anti-Semitism. And it's, just much more sort of in line: racism, hostility, prejudice, vilification directed towards Jews or groups of Jews because they're Jews. So I think maybe IJV is sort of the third place that people are looking for a definition that is outside of the scope of including Israel and Palestine as part of the conversation around anti-Semitism, in order to kind of combat that framing of it at all. So, and I'll share, they have a great resource, IJV does, and I can share that on what we can do around this. So PAL Legal and JVP and lots of other organizations have been working on some talking points around IRA. And I know, I just wanted to share some of these with you because I know this comes up, and they have a wonderful one-pager on this so that I can also share that resource. But basically, these are some talking points when we're thinking about IRA and when we're talking to legislators or, college students, people who are making these decisions. Basically, IRA itself is just a tool for censorship and not safety. Like it was specifically designed not with protecting Jewish people in mind, but in suppressing organizing for Palestine and speech on Palestine. It is broadly opposed by many organizations, including the ACLU, including the people who wrote it. A large swath of academics oppose this because it infringes on free speech. And regardless of your belief system, BDS is a constitutionally protected form of free speech, and something like IRA goes, specifically in opposition to that. We also know that defining anti-Semitism doesn't dismantle anti-Semitism. Like, those two things are not the same thing. And so the idea that just passing this bill or passing IRA that does so much harm is what's actually going to create safety for Jews is a false idea. And in fact, in many ways, I think can be argued that it works against creating safety for Jews because it isolates anti-Semitism from other forms of oppression, and it's not addressing the root causes of it. So we're not defining racism. We're not defining anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism. We're not defining ableism. We're not defining anti-queer hate. We're separating this out and saying, for some reason, anti-Semitism needs its own definition and it's different than these other things, when in reality, we know that all of this is grounded in white supremacy, and that if we want to dismantle this, we have to do this together, in solidarity. So really quickly, I know we're getting close to the Q&A time, so I'll be quick here, but this is a little bit what happened at Butler. These are some of the things that we did at Butler this fall. And at Butler University, they brought the Students for Justice in Palestine brought an exhibit that was an American Friends Service Committee exhibit on boycotts, the history of boycotts. It's a poster exhibit. And then they had a speaker, Dalit Baum, who's with AFSC, who's their director of economic activism, come as a speaker to talk about different forms of economic activism. And the Hillel group on campus, the Zionist, Jewish Zionist group on campus, supported by the local Jewish Community Relations Council, staged a very strong campaign to try to get the event canceled, and then ultimately try to censor these students by passing IRA through the school's Student Government Association. So Butler has some phenomenal organizers, just outstanding, incredible Palestinian-led organizing happening on campus that were so effective and did a ton of work, and were ultimately able to defeat IRA in the Student Government Association. And I just wanted to share some of the tools that they used, because I think this is going to keep coming up again and again. And the way that they organized this really was quite effective. So they wrote letters to the editor specifically on this issue multiple times. And one of the important things they did in this letter to the editor when we knew the IRA was coming was they got several organizations from Butler to sign on to the statement opposing IRA. And then they got community organizations to do the same. So we got as many different groups as we could to stand up and challenge this. And it was a very broad coalition of folks who were challenging IRA, which just made it easier to speak out against this. They used Jewish Voice for Peace at the national level and asked people to email Butler's faculty and administration. Up to that point, they had only been hearing Zionist voices. And so we found that it was quite important to hear from many, many people in support of Palestinians and saying that that this definition was going to be oppressive to Palestinians and to Black and Brown students on campus. One of the things that we noticed in all of this was kind of this co-opting of language, this co-opting of progressive language, and what kept being said to these Palestinian students was, only Jews have a right to define anti-Semitism. Like, you don't have a right to tell me, how to define this. And it really did feel like this co-opting of language that had been used around anti-racist work and communities, talking about themselves and advocating for their own liberation. And so I think it was confusing for students who weren't Jewish and weren't connected to Palestine and didn't understand this issue. And so they're saying on one hand, like, yeah, these Jewish students are saying, like, we get to define anti-Semitism, and that makes sense to them, but then not taking into account of the fact that this definition was specifically oppressive and in an attempt to silence, Black and Brown students specifically on the campus. So it was very important to kind of find ways to make that connection for people and help them understand that self-determination can only go so far, because when your self-determination then silences another group's self-determination, that's when we sort of run into a problem with that. And that ultimately they were able to make that case, I think, and they were able to defeat IRA. It came up again at the end of the year. They invited Angela Davis to come to campus. Same Zionist organizations opposed it. The event got canceled, and then there was a humongous backlash, an international backlash, and the event got reinstated and was wonderful. But you could see them sort of leaning on this IRA definition and this idea of anti-Semitism as the reasoning for initially canceling Angela Davis. So, I mean, ultimately, to me, what this comes down to is this idea of safety through solidarity, and that truly making this world safe for Jews, for Palestinians, for Muslims, for any group who faces oppression in any way, does require solidarity amongst all of us. And to me, that means taking a strong Jewish stance against Zionism. I don't think it is good for Jews. Obviously, it's not good for Palestinians. And we can, together, I think we have the best chance of overcoming Zionism, of freedom and liberation for Palestinians, which will further freedom and liberation for Jews. And now I would love to hear your thoughts and take any questions and comments, etc. Maybe I should stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Malkah. We'll start with a couple of questions, and then if folks have more personal thoughts and anecdotes to share, maybe speaking to your question of how has definitions of anti-Semitism impacted your work for collective liberation, just let me know in the chat or Q&A, and then we can unmute you for a little bit and you can speak that way. I believe that all cameras will still be off during that, and we are still recording. So, okay, so current anti-Semitism is fueled by apartheid in Israel against Palestinians. Do you have any idea of what % of Jewish people actively support Palestinian liberation in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, it's very hard to get numbers out of Israel. And I think that's, very intentional, of course. They don't teach the Nakba in schools in Israel. It's illegal to teach the Nakba. I think you will find that both here in the US and in Israel, the Hasbara campaign to suppress knowledge, to suppress understanding is alive and well. And so I don't know those numbers in Israel, but I will say here in the US, there was they do a very well-funded poll, big, huge poll for Jews every few years. And I think the most recent numbers that came out sent some shockwaves through the organized Jewish community, especially those who are more supporting Zionism, because the number of, I think it was up to 10% of Jews who answered these surveys said they support BDS specifically. I think there was huge numbers saying that they did not support Israel, that they really were opposed to the occupation specifically. So things are changing, certainly here in the US and anecdotally in Israel as well, from what we're seeing now. Obviously, it's not the mass uprising that we need in Israel, but I think that the work that is doing by Palestinians in Palestine is starting to make a humongous difference in getting their story out there and visibility for, the crimes of Zionism.
Okay, next question is, please provide some background information on the Jerusalem Declaration. Who is responsible for this declaration?
So this was, I don't know who started it, but it was a group of Jewish scholars in both Israel, US, and Canada. I think there's about 200 scholars that are assigned onto it. People, I think, specifically who identify as academics in Jewish study, in some version of Jewish studies, are signed on. So people like Sarah Roy from Harvard, lots and lots of other names of folks who are on there. And they have a whole website. They just hired a US organizer for the JDA, specifically for the Jerusalem Declaration. So that's why I said, I really think that we're gonna see this a lot more making its way. I could see a group like J Street or, some of these more liberal Zionist organizations who do oppose the occupation, aren't still sort of consider themselves to be two-state organizations, that the JDA is something that they would move forward with. And so I do think we'll be seeing a lot more on it. But there is a website, and maybe Maddie, you can link to it, that goes deep dive into the JDA, and it has all the names of the signers and the people who convened to create the definition.
Perfect. Is it JerusalemDeclaration.org? Do you know?
I think it probably is.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I'll link that in the chat in just a minute. Next question is, what can I say to Jewish friends who say that Israel as a Jewish state is justified by the Holocaust?
Yeah, and this is always the question, right? It's such a good question. I think there's a few things that come up, and I'll say, I know this from incredibly personal experience with my own mom. We went through this for about 2 years, and now she's a proud JVP member, but that's where our conversation started. And it's, the Holocaust was incredibly traumatic. Of course it was. And I think that as Jews, as Ashkenazi Jews, as Eastern European Jews, generational trauma is a very real thing, right? Our community experiences trauma. I don't know any Ashkenazi Jews who don't have some family or connection to people who died or suffered in the Holocaust. And at the same time, the Palestinians were not involved in that, right? What we're doing, we have to find a way to heal from that trauma without enacting that trauma onto another group of people. So I think sometimes people are very surprised to find out that Zionism began before the Holocaust, right? Zionism began as a settler colonial movement in the late 1880s, 1890s. And this was long before the Holocaust happened. So it wasn't like this trauma happened and all of a sudden it was like, boom, this empty land was available for Jews. That's not what happened. And I think it's important to start to sort of define this as this settler colonial movement that was replacing an indigenous population that wasn't involved in the Holocaust in any way. And the other way that we sort of started to talk about it, my mom and I was basically like, look, Jews left Europe as refugees following the Holocaust. Like, nobody is disputing that. That's why we did leave in that way. But when we came, we weren't immigrating, right? We weren't moving to a new space and becoming part of the society that was there as refugees. We came in as settlers, as colonizers. We were taking people from their homes. We were replacing them, this population, with a Jewish population, this indigenous Palestinian population with a Jewish population. And that is not immigration, that's settler colonialism. So we as refugees then created refugees, right? And I think to start to conceptualize that is really important part of to me getting over this idea that because of the Holocaust we need Israel, and that's what's making it safer. And I will say this other piece about it that Rabbi Brant Rosen speaks about much more better than I do, but basically part of the argument for Israel, the existence of Israel within Jewish communities, is this idea that there's anti-Semitism, rampant anti-Semitism, and Israel is the only place we're safe. And I saw this actually quite a bit, even in the past month, as people were criticizing Israel and their actions. People were saying, see, this is why we need Israel, because the whole world is turned against Jews and nobody will help us. And it's a little bit distressing that this need for anti-Semitism exists in order to justify Israel. And it makes you wonder if we're able to both fight anti-Semitism at the same time as we need anti-Semitism to justify the existence of the settler colonial violent state that is causing such harm. And so I've always wondered, and Rabbi Rosen wonders, like, can we actually be fighting anti-Semitism when we need it so much to justify our actions in Israel? And I think that's something to think about, and I don't have an answer to that, but it's certainly something that's on my mind.
Thank you for that. I've never thought about it, in that way, the relationship between anti-Semitism as justification for settler colonialism. Someone says, thank you for this clear definition of terms. You have given us a great gift for further communication.
Well, thank you. Hope it was useful. I know it was a lot of information thrown at you.
I think it was useful. Recently, a speaker on Palestine-Israel said that racism was not a part of the Israeli oppression of Palestinians. You say that white supremacy abounds in Israel. So would you not agree with this speaker's statement? And then could you maybe elaborate more on that?
Will you say that first part again one more time?
Yes. So this person says, recently, a speaker on Palestine-Israel said that racism was not a part of Israeli oppression of Palestinians. And I'm not sure if this is, if the question asker is saying that a recent MEPN speaker says this or something else they heard. I'm not sure. Anyway, you say that white supremacy abounds in Israel. And then could you kind of elaborate on that and give some examples of how that is the case?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it is extremely clear that Zionism and racism are deeply linked. When you see images, coming out of Palestine, Jerusalem, where people are holding Israeli flags and yelling "Death to Arabs," there's no way that is not racism, in my opinion. The fact that they can't teach the Nakba is a form of racism. I think we have very good corollaries to what's happening to that here in the US. So part of why Zionists are able, why Israel is able to ethnically cleanse Palestinians is deeply connected to this idea of Arabs, to Jewish supremacy, to white supremacy, to this idea of othering. So I think that there's a profound amount of evidence that this idea of a Jewish state, of an ethnocracy, of a place where one group of people is privileged over another group of people is a form of racism and can only exist if you think that a Jewish person deserves something more or better than a non-Jewish person or Palestinian in that moment. So that's one. Two, there is ample evidence of Jewish racism, of racism in Israel against Black and brown Jews. Ethiopian Jews are second-class citizens in Israel. Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews have done a lot of organizing within Israel to demand equal rights, and they live, they have higher poverty, they less access to education, less access to housing services, all the things that we see in very sort of typical racism that we would kind of think of as racism here in the US. It happens in Israel, even within Jewish communities, right? So there's a lot of talk about, there's a Jewish Black Panther group that are an Israeli Black Panther group that are Black Israelis, Ethiopian, other Black Israelis, and they talk about prison reform in Israel. And there are lots of relationships between Palestinians and Ethiopian Jews that have developed because those are the two populations that are the most heavily incarcerated in Israel. So they're meeting each other under incarceration, and communities is forming between that. So what we think of as racism as absolutely is occurring in Israel. It occurs against other Jews who are not white. It occurs especially when we're talking about Palestinians and other Arabs in the region.
Thank you. And then going back to your note on the importance of language and nuance in language, someone is wondering if liberal Zionist is a contradiction in terms, and if you can break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think so. I often think so. There's, maybe you've heard the term PEP before, Progressive Accept Palestine, and I think a lot of us anti-Zionists certainly take issue with even that concept, but liberal Zionism is people self-identify, I think, as liberal Zionists. And they're people who, here in the US would be incredibly opposed to, what we saw, kids in cages at the borders and ICE policy and other policies that here in the US are just abhorrent, that we, that these folks would certainly oppose to. They tend to vote Democratic, these kinds of things. But when it comes to Israel, there is this pass, this idea. And so it's people who might say, in some Jewish circles, we refer to them as 67ers, right? So people who didn't oppose the Nakba, who will say, I support the right to Israel to exist. They say this all the time. Israel has a right to exist, but I don't support the occupation. So their protest comes in at 67. And now, obviously, we know that 67 is meaningless without looking at 48. Right, that Palestinians, the issue that happened in Palestine is not 67, but it's not the Nakba, it's the Nakba, and that to think about Israel having a right to exist, whatever that means, without considering all the harm that was caused by the Nakba in the first place, is not a position that can hold up very well. But I think probably, I think liberal Zionists are sort of a self-identifier, and you'll see that in groups like J Street and other maybe even more religious sort of affiliated folks will maybe identify as kind of these two-staters who oppose the occupation, oppose the settlements, but don't oppose, the Nakba colonization of Palestine sort of generally, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it really does. There are some who argue that some Zionists are religiously motivated and not politically motivated. Do you agree with that? And what is your comment on that?
I consider myself to be a secular Jew, certainly. I'm often really surprised by how little understanding of Abrahamic religions happen even in some religious Jewish spaces. This idea that, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are all have similar, the same foundational stories. And so I think, this biblical case for Zionism, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. I do think it is ultimately political. It's about land, and it's about control of the land and control of the region. And you can call it, your reasoning for it, whatever you want to call it. I've had people here say to me, people who don't observe Shabbat, who are not observant in any way of Judaism, and then will say to me, but Israel is biblically the Jews and the temple was here, so it ends up kind of being this talking out of two sides of our mouth conversation. So ultimately this is about ethnic cleansing. It's about colonization. It's about being a settler country and replacing a population. And I think you're going to find a wide variety of reasons why people want to do that, but the impacts are going to be the same. Same with Christian Zionism.
Thank you. Could you elaborate on the connection that Jews and Arabs, Palestinians, are both Semites, Semitic people?
Yeah, so there is an indigenous population, right, of Jews in Palestine. There absolutely is, and so. But the term anti-Semitic itself, again, it's not a Jewish term. It was a term that was created by, it may have been the mayor of Vienna, somebody, to describe Jews, and it was a racist term. It was this part of the Holocaust, part of what Hitler's movement was trying to define Jews as a race. Right. And there are posters that you see, these propaganda posters that were showing that Jews were this inferior race, which was part of the justification for the Holocaust, for the ethnic cleansing of Nazi Germany. And so part of that was this idea of Semites, like Jews are not us, they're not Europeans, they're not the same bloodline as our bloodline. They're this, other, they're this Middle Eastern race of people that therefore this justifies our kind of ethnic cleansing in Europe. So it wasn't a Jewish term. It wasn't Jews saying we're Semites. It has evolved to that, I think, sometimes, not in the use of the term anti-Semitic specifically, but around this idea of Jewish indigeneity to Palestine. And I think that is super problematic, and it is something that all of us are really trying to have to talk about and push back against, and learn more about and help define that while there are Jews who are indigenous to Palestine, you know, there are Mizrahi Arab Jews from that area, Palestinian Jews. Many of us, most of us, Ashkenazi Jews and Jews from other areas are not indigenous to Palestine. So that's a different issue to me than specifically kind of combating this term anti-Semitism and saying that it's the term that Jews are using to claim indigeneity. So that wasn't a term that we as Jews created, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Could you say something or a little bit about Canary Mission and its impact on the people it targets?
It's horrible. It's just absolutely horrible. I think that, you know, there was some really good research that was done to root out where Canary Mission came from. And, you know, I think that there have been some evidence that it's related to Adam Milstein, who is the founder of the organization Israel on Campus Coalition. It's got links to some other federations, maybe out in California. But basically it's this idea that, and it's important because anti-Semitism is insidious, right? Anti-Semitism is dangerous to Jews and to other folks. But then it's this co-opting of this idea and using the fact that anti-Semitism is dangerous to silence people, right? To silence free speech and to specifically harm Palestinians, because we should take anti-Semitism seriously, then when we steal this idea of anti-Semitism and apply it to something that is genuinely not anti-Semitic, it is very harmful. So if you end up on Canary Mission and your picture's up on Canary Mission and your information, and you're looking for a job or you're applying to graduate school or you're just out in the world and someone Googles your name, what comes up is, the first thing that pops up is that you are an anti-Semite, with your photograph, with sometimes your home address, sometimes your email address is on there. It's really harmful and damaging to people, precisely because anti-Semitism is a problem, and it's being used and manipulated by the folks behind Canary Mission to cause harm to Palestinians, specifically to Palestinians, but to others who are advocating for freedom in Palestine. And I think, you know, there's some very famous examples like Stephen Salaita, who have been harmed incredibly by something like Canary Mission, but there's also, you know, hundreds more examples that don't necessarily rise to the level that the visibility of Stephen Salaita that we see here in Indianapolis. We had a student who ended up on Canary Mission, and they put her picture up and her home address and her phone number and plastered it all over the campus at IUPUI. And she dropped out of school. She was not able to finish at that university because of this direct link to Canary Mission. So it's something that we need to speak out against. It's something that Jews need to push back against. I think that, you know, I see the criticism that we shouldn't be talking about anti-Semitism when talking about Palestine because it is not the same thing. But I also see the importance of particularly Jews, but everybody else too, who holds this knowledge, to push back and say, actually, that's not anti-Semitism, and here's why.
Thank you. Someone is wondering if you would be willing to share kind of how you arrived to where you are today in relation to your Jewish identity, your anti-Zionist identity, and if you're willing to share some or all of that personal journey and maybe how that impacted relationships, as you mentioned, you know, interacting with and talking with your mom around these topics and conversations you've had?
Yeah, it's a huge question and I appreciate it so much. I'll try to keep it brief, but, I was raised, I think, and unfortunately, not all, but the vast majority of Jews are either raised in the U.S. or raised in either, outwardly Zionist homes or sort of Zionist adjacent homes where you're exposed to it, it's sort of implicit in your beliefs. Like Israel is mentioned all the time in our synagogues, in our communities. We were taught this idea of, a people without a land and a land without a people. That's something you hear all the time when you think about, Israel and the Holocaust and Palestine, and Jewish education in the US is really centered around, three things like Jewish holidays and traditions, the Holocaust, and then Israel. So those are sort of the three big things that it's centered around. So I certainly grew up with that. Parents who had visited Israel, kind of it was part of our upbringing. And then I had this experience where in college, I actually I'm exactly the same age as Rachel Corrie. Like we're born in the same month, and a friend of mine was friends with her. So when Rachel died, was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza in 2003, I knew, I had a personal connection to her. And it was really confusing to me at the time, I think, because I identified with Rachel and I identified with this friend and really shared kind of values with them generally politically, but it didn't add up with her being, on the side of Palestinians and on the side of Gazans in that moment. And so I think that was kind of the first crack in the armor for me, was having this cognitive dissonance of relating to Rachel Corrie and then seeing that she was on a side that was quite different than what the side of my family or what I had been raised with. So that was the beginning for me, and sort of built from there, but I didn't become active until much later. I think the 2014 war, the Gaza war, was a turning point for me. And then my daughter at the time, she was about 5 or 6, and she started asking about God a lot. And my husband's not Jewish. I felt like I didn't have a great answer. And so I started to try to seek out Jewish resources and kept finding that everything I could find had Zionism as like central to it. Like the synagogues all had the flags and everybody was talking about Israel. And I was just distraught. Like there has to be some version of this that doesn't have Zionism as a piece of it. And at the same time, my parents are saying to me, like, she needs to go to Sunday school and why aren't you at the synagogue? And so we were kind of in this conflict. And through that, I found Jewish Voice for Peace and this whole community of Jewishness and Judaism and justice just opened up to me. It's been the most like profoundly wonderful, freeing, invigorating, life-saving thing for our family is to have this connection to Judaism without Zionism. And that was sort of my journey, and then brought my mom along on it. And, I think it took a long time for us to get there, but I think we did, and we just had hard conversations. And I just encourage other Jewish folks who are kind of living that to keep at it and keep having those conversations, because it is in these one-on-one relationships, I think, especially amongst Jews who were raised with this implicit Zionism, in those one-on-one conversations, we do start to kind of find those cracks in the armor and that cognitive dissonance that is necessary to really break down some of these ideas that we were raised with that are just wrong and were untrue, if that helps.
Thank you. Kind of on a similar vein here, there's a question about building bridges across shared religious traditions and how that can intersect and support anti-Zionist work and, pro-Palestine conversations. Is that enough to go on, kind of?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so, I don't know how it is where you all are in Minneapolis and Twin Cities, but here in Indiana, people love interfaith so much. It's like the thing, and I think for good reason. Like there is real power and value in bringing faith communities together, especially around learning and shared values and justice. And it's been a place where JVP is here locally has really been able to make space for each other and to make a difference, which has been wonderful. I think the kind of caveat to that is that interfaith can also be really used for normalizing. So I've seen a lot of this where it's these Jewish Muslim groups coming together, and there's a lot of rules about what's allowed to be talked about and what can come up and what can be discussed, and it's interfaith except for can't bring politics into it. And I think that that's incredibly harmful. So finding that place where Christians and Jews and Muslims and whomever can come together and celebrate ritual and celebrate shared background can be a wonderful way to bring people in and start to make these connections while centering Palestine in it. And I think that's something that we at JVP here locally, we have created a lot of our own ritual spaces, especially because there just isn't Jewish space to be doing these ritual things like Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, these kinds of things that aren't Zionist. And so we've found that our best bet is kind of to create our own, but we've invited our community in. So people come in and they celebrate with us. And so it's Jewish and it's ritual and it's powerful and it's justice, but it's also political. And I think we're really explicit that the politics matter in this moment. And it's a space where we're continually focusing on the mission of justice for Palestinians, while upholding our Jewish values of, collective liberation and healing the world and justice, which are so important to our Jewish values. So I love the idea of that being a space where people can come together and we sing and we eat and we, celebrate these rituals. And we also explicitly bring politics in with us and make sure that it's not a place where people have to check part of their identity at the door in order to be engaged with it. And well, I don't know, like, I just think that there's, I remember the first time my mom came with me to a JVP thing, and it was a Shabbat service. She was at a Shabbat service, and she kept turning to me and she'd say, like, these are Jews. These people are really Jews. And I think there's some power to that too for us, because as Jews, we're often told if we believe these things that we're not really Jewish, or we're, traitors to our Judaism, and to then say, like, no, we're reclaiming this Jewishness. We're showing that we are deeply enmeshed in this, and it is through this lens. Like, this is the reason why we're fighting this hard for this. Can be really powerful to people who have felt isolated from a community. So I think there's real value in that as well.
Thank you. People are talking in the chat. This has been such a great presentation. Thank you again. We have a couple more questions here before we wrap up in a few minutes. So audience, if you've got any last questions, please send them in. Someone is wondering, have you read Daphne Levitt's book, Wrestling with Zionism, Jewish Voices of Dissent? If yes, do you have comments about it?
I have not read that one. There's so many books out there. There's great ones about Jews and Zionism and wrestling. And, I value the people who are doing this work. It's a good reminder to me sometimes to check back into those, to remember that it is a process for some people. And I think, like someone just said in the chat, like, if you've lost family in the Holocaust, or you grew up with this trauma, and you grew up with this learning and this myth about Israel, that it is an unlearning that has to happen. And having as Jews, having compassion for other Jews who are doing that unlearning is a place where we can really work in this movement. And I think that's an important distinction, that asking Palestinians and people impacted by the occupation to have compassion for Zionists as they, unlearn is something we would never want to do, right? That's not a space that we would want a Palestinian to have to occupy. Like, you don't have to have compassion for your oppressor. But as Jews who have gone through this ourselves, or in some version of that, to be in those spaces can really be a place where we can do some learning and can support folks as they're moving through this, so it's something that we wrestle with, especially when we work in coalition with Palestinians, is what are things that as Jews we need to be taking the lead on and having these conversations, and then what are things that we wouldn't ask Palestinians to do, and then what are things where we're following the lead of Palestinians and we're saying, what, this is not the space to bring Zionists into this conversation.
Thank you. Appears to be our last question here, and this is kind of veering into theology territory. But actually, before I ask the question, reminder to everyone that we have our forum feedback survey link in the chat a couple times. We would really appreciate your feedback on this forum and then input for future forums. So please check that out, and it will also be in the email with the follow-up links and materials. Anyway, so the question that we have is, can you address how Zionism is not supported or is contradicted by traditional Jewish religious tenets?
Yes, a little bit. I will say the caveat on this is that I am not a religious Jew, and I would never claim to be one. But Judaism is founded on this idea of mitzvahs, which is the Hebrew word that means good deeds, and on tzedek, which is the Hebrew word for justice, and on tikkun olam, which is the Hebrew word that means to heal the world. So I think fundamental to Judaism as a concept, as a religion, as an ethnicity, that justice is the kind of main pillar of this. And I think similar to Islam and similar to Christianity, this idea that it is about justice, it's about goodness and good deeds. So to me, that in and of itself puts us in a place where we would be anti-Zionist, like we would oppose everything that Israel is doing to Palestinians, like just baseline of what Judaism is. I remember when I was little, I asked my mom, like, who are the Jews? And she said, Jews are the chosen people. And I said, chosen to do what? And she said, chosen to be Democrats. And, I think I know a lot more about like Democrats and about Judaism now. So I know what she meant. And I think what she meant was like endemic to Judaism is this idea of justice and righteousness and doing the right thing. So I think that there is a piece of that is obviously in direct conflict to what we're seeing happening from the Israeli government, happening in Israel right now, happening to Palestinians. And then I don't know much about this, but I would reference Ben Lorber's article, and I can share that out as a resource, but talking about this idea of Jews in exile and this Orthodox belief that comes that, you look at the story of Exodus and other stories from sort of a more biblical Torah perspective, and that there is a case to be made about anti-Zionism in that as well.
Thanks. Okay, now the last question. How do we engage in conversation with a synagogue that is not open to addressing Palestinian concerns?
I don't know. I would love to hear what you think. I think that sometimes it's about engaging with specific members of that synagogue, people who you think might be more open to having those conversations, and then asking them to go to leadership and bring this up and ask for these conversations and these questions. And I would say, as especially, this is a whole separate talk that I hope somebody gives someday, but there is a case to be made that, and Mark Ellis makes this case pretty well, that, after the Holocaust, there was this kind of Christian people, some members of the Christian community shared this concern that they didn't support Jews during the Holocaust, that people sort of turned their back on Jews when they needed it the most. And the reaction to that was kind of this sort of blanket support for, Jews, Jewish people here in the US, which then got sort of manipulated into the support for Israel. And so you see that, and we see that here in Indianapolis quite a bit, that this faith community, this interfaith community is sort of inherently Zionist because they've interpreted support for Jews to mean support for Israel. And so I think part of it is just pressure on our own communities, on our own churches, on our own groups that we're part of to say, you know what, supporting Jews does not mean supporting Israel. Like we have to push back against this. We can be, supportive of our Jewish siblings, our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Jewish community members, and be pro-Palestinian. And these kinds of pressure, this kind of language does start to change the conversation a little bit. And I think a lot of synagogues have gotten a free pass to just be Zionist, and it's okay to be Zionist, and there's nobody's checking them on that. And as the conversation shifts and we realize that any movement for racial justice, for equity has to involve Palestine as part of that conversation, then that increases the pressure on these synagogues to say, look, if you're advocating for immigrants, if you're advocating for housing justice, for food justice, for climate justice, like Palestine's part of this conversation. You can't leave it out, and it will isolate you if you're refusing to acknowledge what this is about. So I think that pressure works. And here in Indianapolis, we've seen some churches, some coffee shops hanging Palestinian flags in the windows, and those kinds of things really do end up adding up to make a difference, and putting the pressure on synagogues to say, are we progressive? Are we going to be progressive, or are we going to not be? And we can't kind of walk both of these identities at the same time. We cannot be both progressive and Zionist simultaneously.
Thank you so much. We've just really appreciated your time with us and all the insight and information that you've shared with us. Janet, do you have any closing words?
I certainly do. I want to echo what Maddie has said to you, Malkah, about your ability to articulate this very complicated issue. And judging from the number of questions that we have had, I think more than any other speaker that I can remember in the recent past, as well as those who hung out to the end, it's clear that this was a very, very important subject, and you addressed it well, and personally, I might add. Your personal story is compelling. So thank you for that. Maddie also already reminded people to do the evaluation. It's a quickie, so please, please, please do that. And also, in keeping with Middle East Peace's now traditional schedule, there will be no July or August forum. We look forward to seeing you all in September, and stay tuned, because we will be in the fall launching both in-person forums as well as via Zoom. So we're working on that. And finally, if you are new to MEPN forums and like what you see and hear, please consider becoming a member. Yearly dues are very reasonable and help sustain the high quality of our speakers. Thank you and goodbye.